Hello everyone. For this video, I'm going to be doing a bit of a haul video of the many fine additions to my collection of film, music, and game-related nerdy items. I've got like figures, games, records, and a book to talk about. So it's a bit of a Christmas haul, but some of these are also gifts to myself. And on that note, let's start with the most important first gift, and that is beer. This is a Dark Matter by Hoyne. This is one of my favorite beers. Always drink responsibly, please. And, what better way to celebrate the holidays than with a good drink? So, let's begin. I always love the sound of glass. It's a very nice sound, just nice and simple. This beer is a dark beer, as the name would suggest, and it is a roasted malt with very mild on the hops. Usually it comes in these single serve ones, but a lot of good bars will have this on tap. So, let's begin. Okay. Cheers. So, I had a pretty good holiday. Hopefully, all of you did as well. And I figured that there was a nice variety of gifts that I'd been given and gifts that I'd bought myself to just talk about a nice little random assortment of stuff. So, first off, I don't know if you guys know about these Pop Funko figures. I don't really collect them that much as a few other people I know, but they are a nice little gift. So, first set I have, this is Bill and Ted from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which is one of my favorite comedy films. It's just such a really great, silly 80s adventure. Very similar to what Wayne's World would do a few years later. The basic story is that Bill and Ted are high school students that are about to fail their history class. And so for their final project, they need to do a report on a great historical figure. And so a time-traveling George Carlin from the future comes with a telephone booth, a nice little Doctor Who reference. And they use this time-traveling telephone booth to go through time to get a bunch of famous historical figures like Abraham Lincoln, or Genghis Khan, or Beethoven, or Socrates. They also have some hilarious mispronunciations. They usually call Socrates Socrates, or Beethoven Beethoven. So these are some nice little figures. I also like that Keanu Reeves, it was sort of the start of his association of constantly saying, "Whoa." And I also like the little poses. They've got this, the air guitar, and the whole I'm Bill S. Scott Presquire, and I'm Ted Theodore Logan. It's a really great movie. Really love it. A lot of great classic 80s-ness to it. So that's kind of cool to have the figures for that. other figure, this is a new one. This is Jack Torrance from The Shining, which is one of my favorite horror movies. Just pretty much anything Stanley Kubrick ever did, I love. I like this figure that he's got the axe as well. That's a nice little touch. And I don't have the box with me right now, but the box has Red Rum written on it. So that's a nice little addition. The Shining. It's kind of funny because as an adaptation, from what I've heard, I haven't read the book by Stephen King, is actually very inaccurate to the source material. So it's kind of interesting that such a classic horror movie, one of the all-time greats, is actually a very poor adaptation from the novel. I've heard that the miniseries is more accurate, but I haven't watched it. And this is kind of a thing that I felt Kubrick did with almost every movie he did. They were very loose adaptations of the source material because he had his way that he wanted to do the story, because he was such a perfectionist, and therefore he was going to do it the way he wanted, not the way the author wanted. Even 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was written at the same time that the novel was, because he worked on it together with Arthur C. Clarke, that still ends up being very different between the film and the novel. For those who've only seen the film and haven't read the novel, one major difference I can think of is that the whole I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that, open the pod bay doors Hal scene doesn't actually happen in the novel. That sequence of events is completely different. I'm glad that the film is different because it's such an iconic moment. But that's an interesting thing to note. And then in terms of The Shining, I think one nice little detail that someone pointed out to me is that in the book, the book specifies what Jack Torrance's car is, like the model and the color. And the car that he drives in the movie is not that car. It's not even close. But there's a scene where a character is driving by a car wreck, and the wrecked car in that scene is the proper car that the book describes. So perhaps that was Kubrick's way of saying, I'm doing it my way. I think what makes The Shining so scary is really this sort of concept of unknown horror. Like, nothing's really ever clearly defined, and so there's just this unnerving sense of dread throughout the whole thing. And that's what I really like. It's really this fear of the unknown, and fear also of just a random person. Like, Jack Torrance, he's not like a crazy supervillain. He's just a regular person who just happens to go a little stir crazy. And that is really what's truly terrifying, that the insanity is within us, within anyone, not that it's some kind of special thing. Perhaps there's many layers to the film. There's documentaries explaining the true meaning, that it's about the Holocaust, about the First Nations genocide, that it's about how Kubrick faked the moon landing by using leftover footage from 2001. I don't really know if all those theories are correct. They definitely do point out some interesting things to notice. But overall, I think that's really what makes The Shining so great, that there's just so much you can analyze from it. And that's why it's still held up to this day. In terms of dark, malty beers, this is definitely the best one. It's really the perfect blend of dark and malt. It's It's not bitter, though. It's very smooth. And that's kind of what I like. I find bitter usually only goes good with seafood for some reason. On the topic of unknowable horror, this is a book that I'd been interested in getting, but I didn't know if anyone was actually going to go out of their way to get it for me, and I'm really glad that they did. This is the Necronomicon, which is a collection of the best weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft. You may recognize him from such greats as The Call of Cthulhu and Shadow over Innsworth, I believe was the name. What's interesting is I haven't actually really read much of H.P. Lovecraft at all, but I've always been interested in his writing, mainly because a lot of things I love are influenced by his style. Some really great Metallica songs, the whole concept to Bloodborne is very Lovecraftian. A lot of other great movies like Reanimator and From Beyond, which are both short stories that feature in this collection. At the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow over Innsmouth, those are two other very big ones that I know of. So, his whole kind of idea, from what I gather, is that there are much greater beings in the universe than what we can perceive, and these great ones, or old ones, as they're referred to, could be literally just right above our head, but we do not have the mind power to comprehend such creations. And that's why usually when it comes to like insanity portrayed in film and games, usually there's some sort of Lovecraftian element to it, that things are beyond our comprehension. It's something that I know Stephen King was really influenced by. The back of the book is a quote from Stephen King: "Lovecraft opened the way for me as he had done for others before me." And then this is something that was really implemented in the game mechanics of Bloodborne with the concept of insight and frenzy. And this idea was that as your character was gaining more insight and seeing more into these cosmic beings, that it would be that much easier for you to slip into frenzy or insanity. And one of the short stories near the beginning of the book that I had just read, I believe it's called Dagon. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I'm usually very bad with pronunciation. But it's this story of this man coming adrift on this island in the middle of the Pacific, this non-existent island, and he encounters this vast, Polyphemus-like, loathsome, stupendous monster of nightmares with giant scaly arms, and this drives him insane, so much that he can barely remember his journey back to civilization, and he becomes helplessly addicted to morphine. And that's kind of what I feel is the basis for a lot of his stories, this idea of being unable to comprehend the great cosmic monstrosities because we are just so insignificant compared to them. One sort of detail I've noticed, and I don't know if this is intentional on Lovecraft's part, it's just an observation, me trying to analyze what I've read and heard about his writing based on his personal life, is that if I recall correctly, his father suffered from some sort of mental illness, like dementia or schizophrenia. I don't know what the the specific one was. And at a very young age, Lovecraft had to grow up with his father like this, and therefore I'm assuming that that relationship was probably very estranged due to his father's illness. And so, at least from what I've read of Call of Cthulhu, is that perhaps his writing of these cosmic monstrosities is perhaps his way of dealing with and comprehending mental illness. It's something that we still don't fully understand to this day, let alone back in the 1920s. And so perhaps this was his way of taking his personal experience and extrapolating it to a science fiction element. You know, why do people go insane? Where does this mental illness come from? What if we decided to do a story about trying to comprehend the vast secrets of the universe that are on some other higher plane of existence? And I don't know, again, if that was the intent of his work, but just from my initial observations, that's kind of the sort of vibe that I got. I'm definitely looking forward to reading all of this, because there's definitely going to be some great stories in here, but it's quite a large book, so it'll probably take me a while. Next segment, we're going to go over some recently acquired video games. It is the ultimate first world problem, I find, that I have too many to choose from right now, because I find I'm a very, one game at a time person. I find it very difficult to try to balance multiple games, especially when they're very story-based, which usually most of the ones I play are. I'm usually not one for multiplayer games or MMOs or anything like that. I'm a very single-player, story-driven type of person. So, first one I've got here, this is The Last Guardian, which is developed by Team Ico and Japan Studio, and this is the team that made Ico and Shadow of the Colossus. Now, I don't have it with me here, but I do have the PS3 version of Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, and I haven't played Ico yet. That's another one to add to the list. But I have played Shadow of the Colossus many, many times. That is one of my all-time favorite games. I just love everything about it. The soundtrack, the art direction, the gameplay, the environments, just everything about that game is so artistic and cinematic and just total perfection and atmospheric, and it's everything I love. So this game, The Last Guardian, was the highly anticipated follow-up. I don't know if it's meant to be set in the same universe or anything like that as Shadow of the Colossus, though this bird, dog, creature, he seems very much like a Colossus, only a little more animalistic. But in any case, I do really love their style of game making, and I was really interested in this game. I was sort of a little bit drawn away by the mixed reviews that I heard at the time. Also, I had a few other games on my plate, but now I finally have it, and I'm looking forward to eventually getting around to this, because I do like a good, artistic game, one that's a little more than just shooting and guns or knights and dragons or stuff like that. Something that's, a little more in depth. And, well, I'm sure it's going to be frustrating. I'm kind of hoping that the frustration of trying to get this dog-type creature, Colossus beast, to coordinate with my character is a realistic depiction of if you were trying to get such a beast to cooperate. The impression I got, I think of it like trying to train a dog. You can't just simply press X to get the dog to do something perfectly in real life, right? Sometimes the dog's going to eat food when you want, sometimes he's going to tear up your favorite pillow. And I'd like to think that the frustration is going to be a more realistic depiction, but on the other hand, it might be too real and not engaging. So once I get around to playing this, hopefully I'll enjoy it. But I'm also really looking forward to the PS4 remaster, Shadow of the Colossus. I cannot wait for that. That looks so amazing. Next game, another one that's been out for a little bit that I just haven't gotten around to playing yet, is Uncharted 4, A Thieves End. So, I really love the Uncharted series. I've played each of the originals on the PS3 multiple times. They're just, I feel, the really perfect personification of an Indiana Jones style adventure, with really great set-piece moments and just fun adventure and storytelling and gameplay. Just all around really fun and enjoyable. You know, that's like what I think a really good, fun video game should be, but still with enough, you know, cinematic flourish to it to keep it artistic, right? And then this is the sort of reboot to the franchise, but not exactly. Like, I think the original idea was going to be that Uncharted 3 was the last one, and I would have been okay with that. I think the gameplay was the best in that, because they had just tweaked everything just slightly enough to make it perfect. But I think the story and the ideas were starting to run a little dry, particularly how a lot of the set-piece moments kind of felt they were just there for a set-piece moment. It was very disconnected from the actual plot, or a little too many of the beats felt like they were just basically redoing Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But there was enough enjoyable parts to that game for me to still like it, just not as great as Uncharted 2. But this is kind of the sort of, I think, the last grand hurrah for the series. Drake's coming out of retirement to go on one last adventure. And from what I've seen, graphically it looks amazing, and you know, cinematic, concept-wise, it looks great. I'm hoping the gameplay holds up just as well, and looking forward to it. My only concern is that I didn't necessarily see enough variety from the trailers and sort of pre-alpha footage. I think of the stuff I saw from Uncharted 2, where the main thing they were showing was this big train sequence, or Uncharted 3 with the plane sequence. But from Uncharted 4, most of what I've seen is just driving around a very grimy construction site, or sort of just swinging around in a jungle, or shooting in a jungle. Like, just from what I've seen, there doesn't appear to be as much variety or really interesting set-piece moments, which is what I really like about the franchise. Again, this could just be deception on the marketing part to save the best parts for the actual game. If that is the case, then I'm totally okay with that. I'd like to go into it spoiler-free. But it's just an observation I noticed. But hopefully this ends up being a really good adventure. So for this next set of games, I'm kind of going to talk about them together, because I haven't played anything apart from the intro of either of these, and they kind of are related, because it is Fallout 4 and Skyrim. So these are both third-person, first-person RPGs from Bethesda Studios. They have a very specific way of doing their role-playing games. And while the style of the Elder Scrolls might be more similar to Fallout 3, than to Fallout 4. The basic concept is the same. Basically, in these games, you have a set quest to do that's established in the intro, but you are then set into an open world where your quest can be whatever you choose it to be. You could pursue the main objective, or you could go explore a random mountain or the settlement. The difference is essentially the style. Fallout 4 and the other Fallout games are set in a future post-apocalyptic nuclear wasteland, but the culture is still stuck in the 1950s. So it's got kind of like a steampunk, cyberpunk vibe to it, because you're in a world with like mutant monsters and laser guns and mini nuke launchers and special kinds of stimulation drugs and all that stuff, but you've still got people dressing and talking like it's the 1950s. So it's a very fun world. I've only really played the intro or so of Fallout 4 and of Fallout 3, but I'm interested to get into it. I think initially I wasn't really a fan of that type of style, but lately I've been warming up to the RPG element a little more. And then Skyrim, on the other hand, is more of a knights, dragons, magic, fantasy world. I believe the whole idea is that you are a dragonborn, and you're prophesized to like be the hero of the land or something like that. Again, I haven't played much of either of these, but I know I want to. And the only problem is that in addition to all the other games I now have to choose which Bethesda Supergiant RPG I sink 200 plus hours into to find every side quest. So it's definitely not an easy challenge. I don't really know which one to go with. I'm not sure. I'll have to figure that out, but I'm looking forward to both of these. I mean, regardless of any criticism towards them, I know they're really fun adventures, and that's what they're all about, is crafting your own adventure. Next one we've got is another epic, large, story-based game, and that is Metal Gear Solid 5. This is the definitive edition that has the Ground Zeroes, the Phantom Pain, and all of the DLCs. It's interesting because I really love the Metal Gear games, but they're kind of ones that I've really only played like once or twice, and I think that's because there's just so much to them in terms of story that you really only need to like take it in once to get it the way it is. I mean, I'm sure it benefits from repeated playings, but it's almost such like a chore to get through all of it. It's better to just digest it as one. I know that there's a lot of controversy around Metal Gear Solid 5 because Hideo Kojima, who is the main creator and designer of the series, he was fired from the developer Konami just before the game came out, and he had wanted to do a lot more with the game and the story, and a lot of that got cut out because I think it was like too much for that Konami wanted to commit to. Like, they may have been worried he was going to bankrupt their company or something, or that he wasn't allowed to based on budgetary concerns. So it's unfortunate because I know the game has a very rushed ending. I won't spoil it in this video, but I've already had the ending spoiled for me. But still, from what I've seen and from what I've played gameplay-wise, I really love all of the refined elements to it. Some may take criticism to the lack of proper cutscenes or the sort of cutting down of those elements. But I think I'll have to sort of play it myself to decide. It's definitely a style of a game that I haven't played in a while, but forward to it. I just like that these missions in the game, there's so many different ways to approach it and ways you can do it. You could go all stealth to sneak into an enemy base and rescue a hostage, or you could go in guns blazing, or you could plan to sneak in and plan to go out guns blazing. You can bring different companions along with you, change your setup and your style based on how you want to approach the mission and the design. And I really like that the game gives you the freedom to determine that, instead of being like a linear path of objectives and enemies. You know, it's really nice that there's that freedom in there. But in terms of story, I guess I'll just have to play it myself to see if I actually enjoy it. Last game I want to talk about, this is the BioShock collection. So this is the remastered version of all three BioShock games, BioShock, BioShock 2, and BioShock Infinite. Now, it also has all of the DLC for all the games as well. So, as the sticker says, that's over $100 in value. I really love this series a lot. I've played both the original BioShock and BioShock 2. I definitely liked the first one better, but I liked the gameplay style to BioShock 2, even if the story and the level design was a little subpar compared to the original. And I haven't actually really played BioShock Infinite that much. And the reason for that is because I was playing all of these. Like, I played the first one, finished it, went out, I got the second one, I played that, finished it, and then I got BioShock Infinite. And then the first day I got it, I played about 20 minutes or so. I was a little off-put by the gameplay differences, but I thought, okay, this is still interesting. We're going to do this. We're going to play this. And then the very next day, I was with a friend at the game store, and he pointed out that the Mass Effect trilogy was on sale. And he said, hey, you've never played this series, but you're going to love it. You should buy it. So I said, okay, sure. Bought it, I sat down to play it, and then for the rest of the summer, the only game I played was the Mass Effect trilogy. I've done a video on how much I love that series. I definitely like Mass Effect more than BioShock, so I guess it's not really a comment on BioShock Infinite's quality, more of my ability to get more invested in Mass Effect. But that's because that's more my style, you know, the Star Wars, Star Trek science fiction. So, I do have this remastered collection. Eventually, regardless of the differences, I still do want to play BioShock Infinite. If it's remotely similar to BioShock 1 and 2, I'm going to like it. And I'd also like to replay BioShock 1 and 2. I played a bit of BioShock 1 in this remastered version, and I don't know if it was the remastering of it, but everything just felt a lot more like smoother. Just the combat and the fluidity of movement. I don't know if it was like the frame rate being improved, but I felt there was a noticeable difference, and in a good way. I felt like this was a proper experience of the game. But then again, I am a console peasant, so perhaps if I just played the original game on PC, I would have enjoyed it in the same way. Okay, last section, we're going to be talking about some records. Again, these are gifts, or also gifts to myself, because if I go into a record store, I have to buy something. That's just the way it is. first up, this is Seventh Son of Seventh Son by Iron Maiden. This is from 1988. In my last video, I talked about how much I loved Somewhere in Time, Iron Maiden's previous album from 1986. And while I may not love Somewhere in Time as much, it still is one of my other favorite Iron Maiden albums. And that's probably because they were carrying along a similar direction to that album. This album has a lot more of the prog style to it. There's a lot of more complex arrangements in the songs. And then there's also a lot more synthesizers in the music, most notably the intro to Moonchild, or the midsection and finale of the title track, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. While some may not like this style to Iron Maiden, I do, and that's why these two albums are my favorite. I also really love the album artwork. Iron Maiden always has the best album covers, and in this one, Eddie is some sort of strange being of sorts. And then on the back, there's all these previous iterations of Eddie, like from Number of the Beast and Peace of Mind and Live After Death. So it's a really great album. It's also their first and I think only true concept album. The story is very loose, but the general idea is that the seventh son of a seventh son has the gift of foresight, is clairvoyant, and he tries to warn his village of an impending nuclear disaster. But no matter what, he can't change the future, and the death of them is all inevitable. What I like about this is it's not like a strict rock opera like The Wall or Tommy. It's very loose, and so you can listen to it really in any order if you want, and if you don't really get the story to it, that doesn't really ruin your experience of the album. Like Terminal Redux by Vector, that's got a concept and a story to it, but if you don't really get what's going on in the story, you're still going to enjoy the album regardless, because it's really great. So, some might not like this as much as early Iron Maiden, but I definitely think it's one of their best. Next one, we've got another one of my favorite artists who currently wearing the shirt of, and that is Chelsea Wolfe. And this is Abyss, which is no longer her most recent album, but it is probably either my favorite or second favorite by her. This is from 2015, and I think it was on this album where she really started to incorporate a lot of more doom metal into her style of music. For those who don't know, Chelsea Wolfe, her style is definitely more gothic singer-songwriter stuff. The gatefold through the album is really just the lyrics. But she's got a very dark, inward appearance and style. It's very melancholic and very creepy. And that's what I really like, about her music. There's a lot of really great songs on here, like Carrion Flowers, Iron Moon, Dragged Out, Simple Death, Survive, Color of Blood. The doom metal influence got even more pronounced on her most recent album, His Spun, which is equally great. And I just really love the atmosphere and the vibe that she creates. Definitely a lot of Black Sabbath influence and hairstyle. This is a really great album as well. Sounds great. I'm not going to show you here, but I believe it's actually a blue vinyl as well, which is really nice. And I'd like to eventually get all of her other records as well, because she's a really great artist. Okay, the next one is an album that I'd mentioned in a previous video, and I finally now have in physical form, which is great, because it's fantastic. And that is Magma by Gojira. Gojira are a French heavy metal, death metal, groove metal band. And this new album of theirs is a little more straightforward and mainstream than their early stuff. And the main reason is that the main sort of leaders of the band are the brothers Joe and Mario, who are both the vocalist and drummer. And Joe also does guitar. And very clearly that had an impact on the writing of this album, lyrically and conceptually. But what I like about it is that there are other albums that I love, like From Mars to Sirius and The Way of All Flesh. They're very big, long, sprawling, epic albums that really feel their length, and there's a lot to them, and they're really great in that way. But I also like the simplicity of this album. Not to say that it's too simple. Songs like The Cell and Stranded have some really, really great, awesome moments. But, I think I mentioned this when I talked about Human by Death, in that it's just there's two short sides of music on a single vinyl, and it's kind of nice and simple in that way. It's not like overlong or sprawling. It's just you've got your two sides. They're each self-contained. There's a clear start and stop, a clear halfway middle break, and that's what it is. And it's a very great record. I'm hoping that Gojira will keep making more awesome music like this, because I just love everything about them. This next one is probably the album I was most excited to find a physical form, and that's because it's recently been reissued, and that is Killing Technology by Voivod. In my previous video I mentioned that the only Voivod record I had was the Phobos Negatron split, because that was the only one of theirs that was actually being pressed. And recently, a few of their early records, they've been repressed and reissued, including Killing Technology, which is not my favorite Voivod album. That probably goes to Nothing Face, but it is definitely their best. This is their third album from 1987, and I think it was really when they had the perfect blend of all their influences. Voivod is a band that has changed stylistic influence over the years. Their first two albums are very straightforward 80s thrash, very noisy and violent and very mosh heavy. And Killing Technology is where they were mainly listening to like crossover punk thrash bands, and then only a few others in there like Overkill and Creator. And so the album has kind of a punk crossover vibe to it, but also they have enough unique, weird guitar riffs to it to really make it their own. And then it might not be a concept album, but there kind of is this sort of overall theme going through it. This idea of the future and this sci-fi element. Killing Technology, the song, is just about, the idea of technology overtaking us and just being used to kill and control. And then each other song on the album, I feel, is talking about some aftermath of it. Overreaction is about a nuclear meltdown. and Tornado is about environmental destruction and the effects caused by that. So, this is one of my all-time favorite albums. It's just so good. It's like the perfect classic 80s metal album in my opinion, besides the obvious choices. And I was really glad to find a physical copy of this. I thought I was going to have to go to great lengths to find one, so next up I've got to find Dimension Hatros if they reissue that one. This next record is another one that I never thought I'd find a physical copy of, and that's because it's only recently this year been reissued, and so until then the original pressing was going for like upwards of $500. And this is the Symphonic Suite soundtrack to Ikeda, or Akira if you'd like. I prefer the Japanese pronunciation though. Ikeda is a 1988 anime movie. It's a science fiction future dystopian film. And this is one of the main characters, Kaneda. And it's kind of difficult to describe the story because there's a lot of different elements to it, but basically his best friend, Tetsuo, is starting to gain these psychic powers that he can't really control, and he's going a little power hungry and crazy. And so Kaneda has to find a way to stop him from going completely out of control. There's a lot more to the film than just that. And I think it was definitely one of the most influential films on the science fiction cyberpunk genre. Conceptually and aesthetically, I think it took a lot from Blade Runner, which was just a few years prior. And then Akira that would go on to influence stuff like Ghost in the Shell, and in turn Dark City, and The Matrix, and then Dragon Ball Z, and then from Dragon Ball Z pretty much every other anime ever. So it's one of my favorite films, and not only that, but it also has a really great soundtrack, and the animation is just so marvelous. Just looking at the pictures here doesn't do it justice, but there's so much great animation and music to this as well. What I think I like about it is that I wouldn't consider myself an expert on classical Japanese music, but at least from what I've seen of Japanese film, a lot of times the soundtrack is still very normal sounding. Like it's like a string section or something like that. Or anime theme songs still have kind of like a bit of a rock vibe to them. But the soundtrack for Akira is really all over the place. There's rock music in Exodus from the Underground Fortress, but then you've got traditional sounding Japanese drums and chants in Kaneda's theme, and then you've got more of a sort of monk type chanting and vibe in Battle Against the Clown. It's all over the place in the best way possible. There's just such a really great blend of styles, and it really makes the soundtrack feel unique. So I'm really glad that they did this reissue remastering of the album, because I never thought I would be able to own this on vinyl, and it's really fantastic as well. The film is probably my favorite anime of all time, and it's also got one of my favorite soundtracks. Next one we have is from an artist who I haven't listened to too much of, but I really would like to get into her stuff more because of her unique style, and that is Kate Bush. This is her first album, The Kick Inside. I'll admit that I haven't actually listened to this one too much. Um, most of her albums, I have only heard a song or two. With this album, the main song on it that I know and most others would know is Wuthering Heights, which is a really great song that demonstrates her interesting vocal style. The main one I know by her, the album, is Hounds of Love, which I do also own, but I've had that one for a while. This is the most recent one that I've got by her. I know that initially she got a lot of support from David Gilmour of Pink Floyd. I think he helped produce the album, and I think he might be featured on a song or two. Not exactly sure. But in any case, it even says here, much thanks and love to Dave Gilmour for rolling the ball in the beginning and for helping, get the kick going. So, I don't know where I heard it from, but I would describe her music as uncommercial pop music. It still has that pop vibe to it, but not like mainstream pop, if that makes sense. You'd kind of just have to listen to her to sort of get the vibe, to know what I'm talking about. But a lot of Steven Wilson's new music, he's very inspired by her uncommercial approach to pop music. This next one is one where I really only knew one song by them, but after listening to this whole record, it's fantastic. And after I listened to it once, I basically just flipped it over and started it again. This is So Far by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. This is a compilation album, I believe, because all of the songs on here were previously on other albums or released as singles at the time. And this came out in around 1974, I believe. So this has, the main song that I knew was Ohio, which is a protest song written by Neil Young about the Kent State University massacre. During the protests, there was a very important and significant event in American history, especially during the height of the protests against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. And then there's also Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, a really great sort of multi-part song, Woodstock, about Woodstock, the event, then The Summer of Love, and then another one that I had never heard before, but I really like, is Wooden Ships. And I don't really know what that one's about, but I just really like their style. It's something I'd probably have to be in a specific mood for, but I think like when I finally listened to this album in full, it was like the perfect time for me to sort of get into their folk, slight rock style. And it's a really great classic piece of music from the 60s, so definitely recommended. So the funny story about this next album is that I really only listened to the title track for probably a year or so, and it wasn't until much later that I actually listened to the whole album, and the whole album's great, but I still love the title track the most. And this is Maggot Brain by Funkadelic. Funkadelic is a funk rock group from the 70s, and I know some of the members also were involved in Parliament. And I'm not sure exactly why I don't really listen to much straight funk music, and I've never really listened to anything else Funkadelic ever did. But for some reason this album just really clicks with me. And I think it's really due to the title track, Maggot Brain. It's a 10-minute guitar solo set against a very basic E minor chord progression. And I don't know why, but it's just like one of my all-time favorite guitar solos, just like top 5 material. And that's because Eddie Hazel, I believe, is a guitar player. He was told to play the first half as if he'd found out that his mother had died, and then he was told to play the second half as if he had found out that she was still alive. And just, it's the very subtle delay effects that are used. I like how the solo is mainly on one side of the speakers, and then occasionally the delay effect, the echo effect, sort of kicks in the other speaker to create this sort of nice looping sound effect. And again, I really listened to that song a lot, and it wasn't until much later that I actually listened to the rest of the album. But the rest of the album is just as good. Like Can You Get to That, Hit It and Quit It, Super Stupid. Those all have really great, funky, fun rhythms and lyrics and guitar to them. And then you've got Wars of Armageddon, which is this like big giant sound collage over this jam. It's definitely a very weird record. It is very 70s in its style, but I think that's just what's so appealing about it. You know, it's very vintage. Next one we've got is kind of one of those essential albums that everyone owns, and I just didn't have my own copy of it yet, so I had to add it to the collection, and that is The Joshua Tree by U2. I think it's interesting because a lot of people say that, like, you know, no one's really a fan of U2, they just sort of like them, but I don't know, I really love U2 a lot. Like, maybe some people might not like their singer Bono for his sort of egotistical attitude, but he's done a lot of really great humanitarian work, and I like that they're a band that's always trying to reinvent themselves. Even if it doesn't always work, they're always trying to say, okay, how can we do things a little differently? How can we mix things up a bit? Like, if you were to compare U2's first album to their most recent material, it's completely different, but yet there is some similarity. So I like that, perhaps kind of in the same line as someone like David Bowie or Trent Reznor. Everything that they do is similar, but it also is different each time. But without a doubt, The Joshua Tree is definitely where their style hit its peak. The other great one they had was Achtung Baby. But basically side one of this record is like the ultimate in perfection of starters, because it's Where the Streets Have No Name, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, and With or Without You. Right, those are 3 of their biggest songs, and 3 of their best songs, and just 3 of the greatest songs. And then the quality doesn't stop there, because then you have Bullet the Blue Sky and Running to Stand Still, and I think those are very underrated songs. Ones that they still do like to play a lot and do get recognition, but not to the same extent as the first 3. And while the second half of the album might not be as well known or revered as the first half, a lot of those songs still are really good and have that same style to them. So yeah, this is a really great album. I know U2 kind of is like a fun band to hate, maybe not to the extent of something like Nickelback, but I do really love them a lot. I like their style. They're really good. They're fun. They've got a lot of good commentary, and this is a great album. Last record I want to talk about might come as a shock that I actually did not own a copy of this, but this is one of those records where I know it's going to be around forever. So if I were to see this in a record store, and a really rare record, I'd pick the rare record, because I know for a fact that regardless of what happens in the course of human history, that Dark Side of the Moon is not going anywhere. This is probably one of the most iconic albums of all time. Just this album cover. I'm sure even if you haven't heard of Pink Floyd, you've seen this before. It's just like the ultimate minimalist album cover in what it represents. And this is one of the biggest, most influential albums of all time. I don't know if I really can contribute anything new to say to it that hasn't already been said. But there's just something about this album. I think the reason why it clicked so well back in 1973 is that it really does a great job of being a concept album that flows together. Like, every song flows into the next one. The only time it doesn't is when you have to flip the record over to side 2. So, it gives this real unified sense of these two complete pieces of music that essentially is just one long 43-minute piece of music. And thematically, it's a very dark album, obviously, but a very sort of poetic and enlightening one. It's about, the importance of making the most in life, about trying to get past corporate greed and personal gain, and trying to avoid going crazy from dealing with all of it. And just the way it all comes together in that way. I think it was also a very groundbreaking album in terms of the effects and the instruments used on it. There's a lot of synthesizer work on this album, particularly in On the Run, which is this really great instrumental piece. And so that, I think, was another reason why this album was very big at the time. So I don't know if it's my favorite Pink Floyd album. That honor probably goes to Wish You Were Here. But it's definitely the best. Like, there's a reason this album's been like over 700 weeks on the top Billboard charts. It's a little cliche to say it's one of the greatest albums, but sometimes cliches are cliches for a reason. It's because they're correct. And usually when something's very popular, there's this negative reaction to sort of try and discredit it. Oh, well, maybe it was good at the time, but it's not that good anymore. No, what this album has done, the way it holds up, the way you can see pieces and bits of it and everything else, like something like Sgt. Pepper or The Velvet Underground and Nico, or Led Zeppelin 4. Like, it really is that important, and I'm glad that I finally own a copy. Again, it's not like there was a shortage of copies, right? Like, they're always going to be making this one, so wasn't really too worried about that. It's always a good favorite of mine. Well, that is almost everything I have for this haul video, but there's one more. I've saved the best for for last. And it's a game I think many have been hoping that is something that I've been playing, something that I've been working on, something that I've been creating a video for, something that may or may not be related to a few other series of videos that I made that were pretty popular, something that I may or may not do narration for a specific element of a certain game that I just finished and I'm in the process of editing and recording another video for. I don't want to get too much of a hype train going because I have a very consistent upload schedule. I sort of just film when I feel like it, and if I don't feel like it for months, then I just don't make videos. But with the very positive feedback that I'm grateful for, that I received on a few other videos I did, I figured it was in my best interest and intent to continue that video series with this game that I just finished, and that is Dark Souls 3. The boss video for Dark Souls 3 is in the works. I'm not committing to a release date ever, but I'm in the editing process, so at some point in the future that will be released. Maybe tomorrow, maybe 2 days from now, maybe 3, 4, maybe a year from now. But in any case, that's the next video I'll be making, and it'll be out at some point for those of you who are interested. But until then, I hope you enjoyed my little ramble about the latest additions to my collection, and have a good night. Cheers. Always good.